Hello and welcome to our second lesson on Lenin's economic policies. Today we'll be returning to the question, how successful were Lenin's economic policies? A quick starter to warm you up. Can you try and define the differences between communism and capitalism? Now today we're going to be focusing on Lenin's second economic policy, War Communism. War Communism was introduced in July 1918 as a response to the outbreak of the Civil War. The Bolsheviks needed to gear the economy towards a red victory, and they had two big goals. Firstly, they needed to ensure the cities were fed. These were the Bolshevik heartlands. It was vital they maintained their support. And they needed the workers to be fed so they could still produce all the munitions and the materials needed for the Red War effort. Secondly, they needed to maximise industrial production. They needed Bolshevik-controlled factories producing as many guns and bullets and shells and railway lines and all the rest as they possibly could, as many of them as they could, because that would be key to the Red Victory. So Lenin introduced a series of measures which we now call War Communism. You've heard my explanation there of why Lenin adopted War Communism. Could you now turn to the Koren and Fian document titled Why Did Lenin Adopt War Communism and read the first half of the first page. Now we can see from that reading that there are kind of four major reasons why Lenin adopted War Communism: to ensure food supply to the cities, to deal with the problem of rampant inflation, to deal with shortages and the collapse of industry. Now the key aim of War Communism was to put communist theories into practice by sharing out the wealth of the country among the people and to help win the Civil War. So now let's look at the actual measures taken as part of War Communism. There are four main features of War Communism. Firstly, there was the whole-scale nationalisation of industry. All factories were put under state control and geared towards the war effort. In order to ensure maximum industrial production, a strict regime of work discipline was introduced. There were fines for lateness or absenteeism. You could be shot if you went on strike, and a passport system was introduced to prevent workers from leaving the cities. Secondly, to ensure the cities were fed, the Bolsheviks introduced compulsory requisitioning of grain. Essentially, bands of Red Army troops would go out into the countryside and seize, or requisition, peasant grain. This was because during 1917-1918, the peasants had been less and less willing to sell grain to the cities because of rising inflation, making the city's paper money worth less and less. The peasants were choosing to hoard their grain rather than sell it to the cities, so less and less food was reaching the urban population. Grain requisitioning solved this, but it came at a high price. The peasants, quite rightly, bitterly resented grain requisitioning. It led to a huge loss of support amongst the peasantry for the Bolsheviks. Thirdly, to help with the food crisis, a system of rationing was introduced in the cities. The rationing was based on class, so workers who were producing the goods needed for the Red War effort received the biggest rations, while civil servants received quite a small ration, and those that the Bolsheviks saw as class enemies, landlords, capitalists, ex-nobility, they received barely enough to survive. Perhaps the most revolutionary measure the communists took was the abolition of private trade. So now you couldn't buy or sell. The Bolsheviks were trying to get rid of capitalist middlemen who bought grain and goods from peasants and then sold it on in the cities at higher prices in order to make a profit. Imagine a world where we didn't buy or sell anything. It's a huge attack on capitalism. It didn't work though. There was soon a thriving black market. You've now heard my summary of the key features of war communism. I'd like you to read on the Corin and Fian sheet in order to learn a little bit more about these. Use this information to complete the war communism side of the sheet called War Communism versus NEP table. So now we understand what war communism was and where it was introduced, we need to make a judgment. Was it actually a success? Have a look at this picture. The picture shows two Russian peasants who turned to cannibalism following the grain requisitioning of war communism. Was war communism a success? Well, it depends on who you were. For the peasantry, war communism was an utter failure. It sparked a massive famine, and millions in the countryside died. It also led to the creation of some green armies, as peasants banded together to protect their grain from the Red Army troops. The best example of this peasant opposition is the Tambov Rising. Tambov is a region just to the south of Moscow. There, a 40,000 strong peasant force, led by Alexander Antonov, waged a guerrilla campaign against the Red Army. They were eventually crushed by the Bolsheviks, but throughout Russia, the countryside rose in rebellion against the Bolsheviks. Even in the cities, life was hard for the Russian people under war communism. Despite grain requisitioning, there were massive food supply problems. People were starving, even those favoured by the harsh rationing system. The rations were so meagre, it's estimated they actually made up only about a third of people's diets. People made up the rest through the black market. Workers would sell handmade or stolen goods for food bought into the city by illegal bagmen who ignored the ban on private trade. Those who couldn't steal goods from the factories sold what they could: clothes, jewellery, even themselves. The worst hit were the former people, members of the old nobility or bourgeoisie, who had lost their homes and their property and were targeted for humiliation by the urban workers, made cruel by hunger and misery. We can see then that life in Bolshevik cities under war communism was pretty horrific. However, it did achieve the war communist aim of keeping the cities fed, okay, not well fed, but well enough in order to keep production going. Whilst we can perhaps point to war communism as a success in that it kept the cities making all the supplies the Red Army needed, war communism was not just about winning the Civil War. It was also about implementing communism in Russia. Lenin saw it as a way to eradicate any counter-revolutionary forces in Russia and to create his ideal socialist society. In true Bolshevik fashion, he relied upon terror in order to do this. Turn now to the sheet entitled "How did the Bolsheviks use terror to back up war communism?" Read the top paragraph in order to answer the three questions on this slide. So Lenin had this concept of the internal front, that is, enemies within Bolshevik Russia. You had your external enemies, the white forces they were fighting in the Civil War, but you also had to fight this internal battle to remove any vestiges of the Tsarist regime from within Russia. anyone or anything that represented the old nobility or the bourgeoisie needed to be wiped out. Lenin used the Red Terror to do this. Read on to learn more about the Red Terror and answer these questions. Next, I'd like you to choose one of these two tasks to do. You can either prepare a speech which justifies the policies of war communism, and there's a list of things which you should include, or you could imagine you're a worker and list your complaints about the actions of the Bolshevik Party since October Revolution. You're now going to look further into the opposition to war communism by completing the Tambov and Kronstadt activity. This should be on a separate show my homework thing. As I've already explained a bit about the Tambov uprising, I'm going to talk to you now about the Kronstadt mutiny. So the mutiny took place in March 1921. And it's seen as a real blow to the communists because the Kronstadt sailors, positioned in the Kronstadt naval base close to Petrograd, had been the great heroes and supporters of the Bolsheviks. Trotsky had in fact called them the pride and glory of the Russian Revolution. So for them to mutiny within 4 years of the Bolsheviks taking power shows how much the Bolsheviks had alienated the vast majority of Russians. So the Kronstadt sailors were a group of 10,000 members of the Baltic fleet, and as I said, they were stationed in the naval base at Kronstadt, which is just outside of Petrograd. Now they mutinied in support of strikers in Petrograd, and they published a 15-point manifesto which condemned Bolshevik abuses of power, and they called for the legalisation of socialist and anarchist parties, new Soviet elections, rights for trade unions, and an end to special privileges for senior Bolsheviks. Now, this is a big threat to the Bolsheviks. Not only should these guys be supporters of the Bolsheviks, but they're a highly armed, trained military force really close to the capital. So the Bolsheviks immediately needed to gain control and end the mutiny. They sent 50,000 Red Army troops to stage a frontal assault on the island fortress. About 10,000 Bolshevik Red Army troops were lost as a result. However, it was put down. So we can see that there are kind of 4 main bodies of opposition to war communism. We have the peasantry, who hated the grain requisitioning introduced, best perhaps seen through the Tambov uprising. The Kronstadt sailors, who were sick of Bolshevik abuses of power, and the workers, who despaired at their standard of living under Bolshevik rule. So next you're going to produce this table. Can you summarise what was successful about war communism on one side and what were the failures of war communism on the other? Well, arguably war communism was a success. It ensured the Red Army was fed and well armed so that they won the Civil War. This kept Lenin and the Bolsheviks in power. However, it created massive problems among the peasantry, who hated the grain requisitioning and began to grow only enough grain to feed themselves. It created massive unrest in the cities, thanks to the problem of food supply. 7 million people starved to death in Russia during the Civil War. Some even turned to cannibalism. How can we possibly say that's a success? So, here is a quick summary of war communism. It was a harsh economic measure that the Bolsheviks adopted during the Civil War. Its aims were to put communist theories into practice by sharing out the wealth of the country among the people, and to help with the Civil War by keeping towns and the Red Army supplied with food and weapons. The peasants were treated really harshly as a result of this policy. For example, they had to hand over all surplus grain. If they didn't, they would simply be shot. Whether you were an efficient or a lazy peasant, you were both left with the same. It took away any incentives. It also affected the workers, as all large factories were taken over by the government, and discipline for workers were very strict. Striking workers would be shot. As a result of the peasants rebelling and not cooperating with the Bolsheviks, plus bad weather, there was a famine in 1921, and it's estimated that 7 million people died. Lenin could not keep going with war communism. And next lesson, we'll look at his solution, the new economic policy.